Hey, well, good afternoon, everyone. Um, Welcome to this. This is our first activity as part of our Sustainability Innovation Week 2026. This is our second annual Sustainability Innovation Week, and we're very pleased to start it off with this great discussion about common senses. Little play on words there, but great topic to be talking, especially in terms of the Sustainability Innovation Week. Um, we'll get started in just a second, but as other people are coming in, let me just tell you a little bit about the Sustainability Innovation Week. This is our second year of doing this, and it arose from a common perception that a lot of people here at Northeastern were very interested in sustainability, and they had a sense that there were a lot of others as well who were doing good work on it, but we just didn't know who they were. At a large university like Northeastern, there's got to be many people who are doing interesting things, but just by the nature of such a large institution, we don't often know who they are. So the Sustainability Innovation Week really grew out of this common interest in trying to learn a little bit more about what other people are doing, and then finding ways where we can get together and meet each other, network, and share our experiences. So I like to think of Sustainability Innovation Week as kind of a celebration of the work that we're doing. This is stuff that happens all year long, but this is our opportunity to bring it out into the light and really shine a spotlight on some of the great work that's happening here, share it with their community. So, I wanted to mention that this week, this is, as I said, this is our second year of doing this. This week we have over 20 events on four different campuses. And on Wednesday, we will have a series of in-person. Now, a lot of the events are online so that all members of our global network can participate. On Wednesday, if you happen to be in Boston, we do have a couple of in-person activities, including an expo. We'll have about 25 or so booths that are set up where people are showcasing and sharing their ideas and their research. It's mainly research oriented. Um, we also have award ceremonies for two different student competitions. All of this will be happening in the Curry Student Center. And then for those of you who are in CSSH in particular, you may be interested to know that the Policy School is now turning 20. And so, as part of their 20th anniversary, they'll have an event tomorrow night in East Village on the 17th floor. And this will be a session that's called Sustainability Leadership. And it's part of their 20th anniversary celebration. So, with that said, let me go ahead and start this program. Very pleased that Dan O'Brien and Amy Mueller are both here today and will be giving a presentation on common senses, which is a part of BARI. They'll tell you a little bit more about that. Let me just tell you who they are. Dan O'Brien is a professor of public policy and urban affairs and criminology and criminal justice, and he's the director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, which we call BARI. And Amy Mueller is an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering and marine and environmental sciences. So, with that said, let me turn this over to Dan, and why don't you take it and maybe start with a quick overview of Barry.
All right, sure thing. Well, Davis, thank you so much for doing this whole week, quite frankly, you and your team and all your collaborators on this, and for inviting us to be a part of it. We're really excited to be able to share the work with everyone. Just for everyone to get kind of the background or some of the context here, though we'll give a lot more as we go, myself and Amy. BARI, the Boston Area Research Initiative, is a center that is based in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. We've been around I mean, BARI itself has existed for 15 years at this point, so we've been around for a while. And what we do is we seek to advance civically engaged research that leverages data to pursue social, economic, and environmental justice in partnership with the communities of Greater Boston. And there's a number of components to unpack there, but really the goal is to take the what's on the cutting edge of academia and scholarship and science and really put it in the hands of community members and community leaders and to collaborate with them to figure out what those tools can actually do for the real world, which makes it a great initiative for the school public policy because school public policy is very interested in that intersection between scholarship and the real world, but also Northeastern University in our very interdisciplinary approach, our problems-oriented approach as a university, and the hope to keep being at the cutting edge of technology and data and such. And we primarily focus on Greater Boston as a model for cities across the country and the world. There's similar initiatives in a lot of other cities, but it's the kind of work that really requires being fully embedded in the local context. And we've worked with dozens and dozens of public agencies and nonprofits and other universities as well locally on this over the years. And you'll see some of that collaboration as we talk about common census. And if you want to learn more about us, that's our website, bostonarea.researchinitiative.net. It's on the CSSH website. And just to sort of summarize real quickly how we do what we try to do, right? The difference between a mission and activities. We sort of exist on this interesting spectrum from being a center to being a consortium. And some of that is my own idiosyncratic way of defining these different entities in academia. But on the center end, and that's what you're going to hear more about today, Common Census is a great example of how we collaborate, right? We pursue these civic research partnerships where we are really doing the research, figuring out how to translate it into implementation, figuring out how to make resources available to the public, so on and so forth, through kind of very specific collaborations and partnerships. On the other end, we think of ourselves also as a consortium where we convene the civic research community of Greater Boston. We host an annual conference. This year is our 10th annual conference that's essentially like a society meeting, but for people who are using or doing civic research, policy, and practice in Greater Boston. And so it's a great day. It's occurring this year, May 8th on campus. We tend to have about 425 attendees from over 100 organizations locally. We have over 100 speakers sharing all sorts of things that are going on in and around the region that uses data, research, design to advance our communities. And then in between, we democratize data. We have our Boston data portal where we publish as much of our data as we can. And we also design and deliver K through 12 curriculum and programming through our What the Tech program, where we've been doing things around data science and AI and society in collaboration with Boston Public Schools. So we kind of exist on this spectrum, and we do all these things. At any point, I'm happy to talk about any of these things. But today, we're really focused on the collaborate piece. And with that, so I'll turn it over to Amy to be able to introduce herself and talk a little bit about, how she comes into this partnership that we call Common Census.
Thanks, Dan. So nice to see all of these names popping up here. Some folks I know and some new faces. Like I've been introduced by my fine colleagues, I'm Amy Mueller. I'm on the faculty here in engineering and science, but I think spiritually, philosophically aligned with a lot of what Dan just said. So my research is very much embedded in external partnerships, and that started more with agencies like the water agencies that manage wastewater and stormwater, but has moved much more into kind of other government agencies thinking about public health, thinking about transportation systems, and how we connect data that we can get about environmental systems, but also how those connect to infrastructure systems into decision making to really think about public health protection and infrastructure management. So that kind of has been a journey I've been on, and has now more recently branched out also into collaborations with quite a number of nonprofit groups who are themselves thinking about how to measure the environment and understand the environment and protect their own communities and advocate for their communities with their local governments. So it's a really interesting space to work in as an engineer, really thinking about the technical side, but trying to connect all these different perspectives and sometimes be in the room with people who are on opposite sides of those perspectives and be part of that conversation. So as you'll see, Dan is going to give a really nice introduction to this project and what we've been working on together. And then he's going to come back to me to give you a little flavor of what we're starting to do with the data. So thanks, Dan.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Amy. So yeah, let's dive in. We'll give you an overview, as Amy said, of Common Sense as a project, and then Amy's going to show you what it looks like when the rubber hits the road, as it were. Let me make sure I'm in. Okay, there we go. So starting with, I'm going to call it the obvious, but maybe it's not that obvious. But sort of the inspiration for the project at some level, which is this idea of environmental justice, but in the hyper local, right? So we all know more or less. I imagine most of the people, at least in this room, know and understand climate change and other environmental transformations are global. They're happening all over the place. Uh, but their impacts at the end of the day manifest closer to home, right? Not every place on the planet is being impacted in exactly the same way, obviously. And the resultant hazards, things like heat, things like air pollution, are going to vary across communities, right? Each neighborhood in Boston even is having its own experience of the way climate change is impacting it. And historically, the way we think about those sorts of neighborhood to neighborhood differences is a lot around power in planning decisions that have concentrated hazards alongside marginalized populations. Right? So if we go to the neighborhood where we're collaborating with our partners on Common Senses, which is in Roxbury, just to the southeast of campus a little bit here, and that black box is along Blue Hill Avenue, which is where our collaboration is centered. Um, this is a community that historically has been low income, majority minority, and has pretty extensive language isolation, right? It was actually the heart of Black Boston for decades. And over the last kind of 20 years or so, that population has diversified to be a little bit less African American and a little bit more Haitian and Cape Verdean and even some Vietnamese moving in from the east there. So a lot of people who do not speak English as a first language, and therefore this has been classified as an environmental justice community by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Uh, Extreme heat, it's pretty hot in this neighborhood relative to a lot of other places in Boston because it's very high density, right? It has for a very long time been a high density community with lots of triple deckers, right? The Boston special for fitting more families into a building, as it were, and other larger apartment buildings, so on and so forth. And that tends to result in fewer trees and therefore more heat, and quite a bit of pollution because of major thoroughfares, right? Blue Hill Avenue and parts of it are quite narrow. So you get the urban canyon effect where there's a lot of pollution being produced by the cars driving along it, but it gets sort of trapped in there in a canyon sort of effect. So all of that is very much real, right? The idea that this neighborhood has been shaped by decades of planning decisions that do not produce, shall we say, the most comfortable of environments always. Um, but one thing that we sort of came into the Common Census Project with is what about microspatial inequities within communities, right? What if, as you can see in this map here, there are differences in temperature block to block within the community? So it's not as simple as just saying, like, okay, this whole area is hot, right? No, there's something more nuanced and more detailed that we could access and understand and is actionable in and of itself. And so, really thinking about tracking and responding to these hyperlocal disparities will then prevent potentially some of the microspatial inequities that could arise. And this maps for heat. Same thing could be true for air pollution, for street flooding, what have you. Oh, there's air pollution. Sorry, I didn't. I anticipated my own slide. Okay, so then how do you do that, right? So this is a picture of a sensor box, a particular one from a project in University of Chicago, but called the Array of Things. But in general, this is an environmental sensor, and an environmental sensor can be installed, uh, just about anywhere and tell you precisely what is happening at that location based on whatever sensors you have inside the box, be they heat or air pollution or solar intensity, right? How strongly is the sun shining, or a variety of other things you could put in there. Noise, for example. And about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. This was like the big thing in smart cities, right? this was the thing that was going to transform the way we navigate cities because you could then, have a weather app on your phone for like your street corner, not just your town. And you could kind of know what was happening everywhere at all times. This sort of omniscience about the landscape of the city. And it was a really cool idea. What's interesting is I didn't really go anywhere. And in fact, there are some tech folks who say that these technology are just sitting on shelves in their warehouses because it never really caught on, quote unquote, with cities as an investment. And I think part of the reason for that is because in proposing it, the tech companies never really figured out or envisioned what it meant to go from this idea to an actual community and putting the sensors in the places where they were needed or wanted. Like this one that's part of our network that we'll talk more about, which is right next to a major mall that's in Roxbury, right down near Franklin Park Zoo, called Grove Hall Mecca. And then turning that into a full network that addresses the variety of interests, concerns, questions that a community might have. And then even going a step further and making the information that that sensor network would collect available to the public to be able to do with it as they will. And without connecting all those dots, these technologies seem kind of like a hammer in search of a nail. And really, our mission and vision with this project was to figure that out, right? To figure out how to work with a local community to solve the problem of a great technology without an obvious purpose. And so, yeah, so that's what we've tried to do. And that is the mission and vision of Common Census, which, as you can see, part of the catchphrase is take data into your own hands. And that is kind of where we've come to over a number of years of collaborating. But so then the project is based, as I mentioned, on Blue Hill Avenue, on the northern half of Blue Hill Avenue in Roxbury, and kind of bleeding over a little bit into Dorchester. And we've partnered with the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which is one of the most prominent community land trusts in the region, if not the country. Uh, Project Right Incorporated, which is another community-based organization that's based in Grove Hall. So they're based more on the southern end of our area here, and DSNI is based more in the northern half of the area here. And also with the City of Boston's Office of Emerging Technology, which has been a place for a lot of innovation in the policy and practice space, but also has been an immensely useful partner and helpful partner in sort of connecting with the many other agencies at the city to whom this is all relevant, especially Public Works, because they own the poles that one would put the sensors on. You have to be friends with them if you're going to be successful. So our original vision, and this is sort of the scientific mission, if you will, right? We kind of thought, okay, community designed environmental sensor network. You put that together, and then you use AI, machine learning, or whatever other tools for modeling interpolation that you want to use that are appropriate to generate spatiotemporally precise maps of hazards, right? So then we can see them block to block as you're seeing in that map there. But you can also see them over time, right? You can see changes hour to hour, day to day. And then you take account of kind of framework for microspatial inequities, and this is something borrowed in part from some ideas that I published in a book last year called The Pointillistic City. Um, and then you go from there to strategies for mitigation and adaptation, right? And there's a lot of different strategies for mitigation and adaptation, and not all of them are going to work in all contexts. So you really need to then work with the community through what we call participatory modeling tools and workshops to talk about the data, to talk about the strategies and the options, to really think about what matters to this community and what kinds of solutions fit this community. And it's a full process of deliberation and discussion and solution building that actually is using some pretty cool tools that one of our partners, who I'll mention in a moment, CoPI, has been building with her team. And then the hope is to be able to kind of have this whole pathway result in local action, advocacy, and improvements that are not, and I want to be very clear about this, not driven by the nerds, right? We provided the tools and some of the ability to do this, or the ability to put those tools into practice. But really, the action, advocacy, and improvements need to be envisioned fully by the community itself. And this team on the Northeastern side has been the four of us, right? So myself and Amy. I love to say that Amy is our sensor guru. Uh, my job is the kind of the more social scientific connection between data and communities. Moira Zellner, who is also speaking at Sustainability Week this week, or Sustainability Innovation Week, apologies, full name. She is our expert in participatory modeling, and our colleague Michelle LeBoy in CAMD is an expert in green infrastructure, and she's an architect who thinks a lot about what are the kinds of interventions we can use to make a community and a space more comfortable. For today's talk, we're really going to talk about this first one, right? We designed, or at least I'm going to focus on a community designed environmental sensor network. How did we do it? How did we get there? And then turn over to Amy to talk about then how do we use it, right? What are the kinds of information that we can make available and readily actionable? Again, anticipating my slides. Apologies. All right. So I'm going to give this quick overview and then I'm going to turn it over to Amy. So how did we get from no sensors to a network that has 77 sensors, right? How did we figure out where to put those sensors and do that in a fully community engaged process? So we started from sort of this rough framework of how scientists would approach designing a sensor network. Because that gives us at least a framework to start with, and we know that there have been successful sensor networks using this approach. And that is to think about two kind of axes. One is what is the nature of the vulnerability that we care about, right? So vulnerability can kind of be broken up into two components. Exposure, which is it's hot right here, right now, and sensitivity, which is when people have certain vulnerabilities or underlying health concerns or such, they might be more liable to experience, say, a health emergency when exposed to heat than someone who doesn't, right? So you think about both of those factors when you think about where a sensor is going to be most useful. Some places are really hot and have no sensitive people there, and so you're not as worried about those places. Other places might not be as hot, but have very sensitive individuals, and so you actually really care about those places regardless of the temperature distinction from places around it. The other axis is on locations versus hypotheses, right? For locations, you might say, you know, there's an area over there that's all pavement, right? That's going to be really hot. We want to focus on that. And those sorts of places exist in every community, right? There are the locations that you care about. But then there are these kind of systematic relationships, what scientists would call hypotheses of, you know, pavement in general impacting heat, or major thoroughfares in general impacting air pollution. And so there are some examples here, right? So exposure for locations is a main thoroughfare, but if we switch to sensitivity, a location that might matter is a nearby school, let's say. And for hypotheses, the exposure might be this broader question of are places with fewer trees hotter? And for sensitivity, we could extrapolate to are gathering places for children hotter or cooler in general than the rest of the neighborhood, right? So thinking about these big picture systematic relationships. And what is really nice about this framework, I think, is that it doesn't actually make any decisions for you. It just gives you some guidance. And so this gave us essentially an open bucket, or really four open buckets for the community to think about, well, what matters to us and why? What places and how so? So what we then did was we developed a series of activities to surface these insights and more, if the community had other ways of thinking about the challenge, from community expertise, right? To have it really be determined by local knowledge and local priorities. And so our first activity was all about environmental hazards themselves, right? We realized actually off the bat, we couldn't walk into a room of people who had never heard of an environmental sensor and ask them where to put environmental sensors. That was not going to work. So we started by just talking about hazards, right? And so we asked participants to locate environmental hazards in the community. And so we've got these maps, these physical maps that they made. They put stickers on them, they put notes on them, and really told the story of their experience of the various locations in the community where it's hot, where there's air pollution, or where there's noise. And we invited them to put anything they wanted. So there's a lot on there about rats. Can't really track rats with a sensor, But you know what? It's a very, very good thing to understand about the community, that that's a concern. We had about 100 participants across 4 workshops, and they told 529 different stories of hazards that we then put in a comprehensive map that's now publicly available. And what's great about that map is it gives us a lot of locations, but also in the stories that people told, it gave us systematic relationships. So in this example here, the person who highlighted this location said, some trees, comma, a little better in terms of heat. And that gives us an example of a clear hypothesis or systematic relationship from the community that they care about and are attentive to in terms of the relationship between trees and heat. And we got dozens of those through this process. So at that point, we thought, all right, we have enough information. Activity number 2, we used community stories at block parties to ask people where they would put sensors. And so we got a little bit out of that. It was our first set of conversations. It really only gave us Blue Hill Avenue, right? It gave us consensus that there were 10 spots along Blue Hill Avenue that made good places for sensors. We realized we needed to go a little bit deeper, so we did activity number 3. We created a full draft map of sensors throughout the community on main thoroughfares and in the residential districts, where then we basically did an activity where community members were able to pick those up and move them around. It was a little bit like playing Plinko, and right, decide where they wanted everything to be. And then we realized we still had some gaps in our map, and those gaps were not just geographic gaps, they were relationship gaps. And we needed to go out into the community, go to the neighborhood associations and the community-based organizations who were serving those small corners that we were missing and really engage, and hear from them where they would want to put sensors in their area. And so we did that. We did dozens of those last summer, in order to get that done. And by we, I really mean a postdoc who just left. Actually, her name was Denai Torsoglu, but she did Lion's work on this. She really made it happen, going essentially door to door with organizations to figure out where the last 15 to 20 sensors belonged. And what we basically came away with and we found was community expertise was grounded. It allowed us to ground the concepts of exposure and sensitivity in local experiences and local expertise, right? If you have block to block disparities, the people who know about those are the people who walk those streets. And we actually found that this went well beyond assumptions scientists would have made. We used remote sensing data, so stuff from satellites, to estimate some things, and we checked that against the community impressions. They only correlated, for those who are statistics hounds, they only correlated around zero point 0.3 or zero point 0.4, which is nowhere near what you would expect if the scientists were accessing the same exact information or reasonable proxy for the information that the community had internalized and was articulating themselves. So clearly, the community expertise went beyond what we had access to. And so not only did we build a sensor network, we managed to build alongside the community the comfort and trust needed to use it, right? The partnership between us and them. I mean, people who had never heard of an environmental sensor before this now feeling comfortable talking about what a sensor is and pointing it out to their friends and neighbors, telling them where the app is to look at the data, or the website to look at the data, right? That was an essential part of the process, and it makes the rest of the project possible. So it was not just about building a sensor network, it was about building a community-based project, a community-based initiative around that sensor network. So, and then where do we go from there? We launched it on January 27th. This was a fantastic event. It did happen to snow 2 feet the day before, so there were a couple fewer people there than we might have hoped, but it was a really nice way to sort of establish that we had done this. We've released a public platform with live sensor data, and we're very soon starting kind of regular workshops showing community members, especially those who want to be speaking to the data to their local community organization or association, how to use and interpret the data. And we are doing workshops now on the other side of the science-driven solution building, right? Really brainstorming with the community what they would like to see happen now that the data are telling them what the landscape of the community looks and feels like at different times in different places. And of course, fundraising to transfer to a truly community embedded infrastructure. That was always the mission and always the vision. And I don't know how many places in the world have really done that. And so we're fundraising right now to make that a reality. And we're looking forward to those next steps, and they're kind of aspirational, right? We're going to learn a lot about how that works in the coming months. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to Amy, if I can get the stop share to work. There we go. Right.
Thanks so much, Dan. All right. Look at this coordination, like as if we planned it. Okay. So I'm just going to give you one little snapshot, and I think this really comes out of the same spirit as what Dan said, that sometimes you ask a question and you don't get the answer that you thought you were looking for. So we went into this project asking people to tell us about the environment around them, and Dan kind of prefaced this with what was in our mind about heat island effects and potential health effects. And we heard a lot about rats, and we heard a lot about trash, and we heard a lot about other things that were on people's mind. Okay, so I'm going to show you something that's related to an event that happened in the community last year. That's not related to heat, but it did conveniently get captured by our sensors. And this was something really of interest to our community members, aside from maybe the longer term environmental questions that we as a team kind of had in our minds as the motivation behind starting this project. And to me, this really comes as a lesson to be humble, to keep your mind open, to keep your ears open, and to listen to your partners in terms of what they are interested in, and how they define sustainability and how they define what they're looking for their community. Okay, so the event that I want to talk to you about was a pretty big fire that happened last March, actually almost a year ago now. So this was an 8 alarm fire. My understanding is that means 8 separate fire stations had to come to deal with this fire. It was a fire that started pretty early in the morning on a Sunday. So that obviously is, we know when the firefighters got there, but not when the fire actually started. This is what's available in the media. And it was all day. And at the end of that day, basically, the fire chief said that they weren't even sure how long it was going to take them to put out this fire because of the type of the fire. So here's an image that was published by the Boston Fire Department of what was going on during this fire. And you can see why there were concerns about the longevity of this fire and not really knowing how to deal with this. So this was a trash transfer station. So the things that were burning there were various and potentially extremely hazardous. And this is located actually not that far from campus. So you'll see where it is in proximity to our community. All right, so for this map, you can see kind of at the north part of this map, Northeastern, and then if you go down Mount Cass, not too far, actually, it's probably a half a mile walk, you get to the northern reach of where all of these sensors are. And this fire happened just outside of the perimeter of where our sensor network is installed. So our partners were obviously very concerned about how this fire potentially affected their community, and particularly interested in trying to quantify this in an effort to engage in dialogue with the owners of this property to prevent events like this happening in the future. So that's an ongoing project for them, and understanding whatever our sensors can tell them in terms of the potential danger and impact is part of what can drive that conversation. So for them here, sustainability is being defined as how do we protect our community into the future, and how do we manage the kind of businesses and events that might be happening in this community that could potentially be a risk. All right, so the orange dots you're seeing here are where our currently installed sensors, air quality sensors only are. But at the time that this happened, we only had the backbone installed that Dan had mentioned. So these ones in purple boxes are the ones that were actually installed at that point. So the closest one was maybe a quarter mile away from the fire. It's not very long distances here, but you can see that we didn't have anything like exactly adjacent or ringing around this fire. The other thing I wanted to mention is for air quality monitoring, there is a government program. The EPA Clean Air Act means that we need to regulate, we need to monitor to keep compliance with the regulations across the entire United States. There happens to be a Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection monitoring station pretty close to where this fire happened. So again, a quarter of a mile, it's about the same distance as our closest sensors. And I'm going to provide you data from that location as well as a reference point, just so that we can start to see a little bit of the heterogeneity in the neighborhood that Dan had mentioned, we are getting visibility on in this project. All right, and to avoid giving you just like plot overload, I'm going to pare down to this subset of sensors that goes down the backbone of Blue Hill Ave. So coming up in the following sensors, I'm going to show you the data from the Mass DEP station, and then these kind of 5 sensors going down the north-south backbone of Blue Hill Ave. The numbers are like the identifiers, and that's the short way to identify them. So that's what you're going to see in the legend, but I will also keep them in an order so you can kind of see this north-south transect. All right, so the total distances here, like a quarter of a mile from the fire to the northernmost sensor, and then maybe max a mile from the northernmost sensor to the southernmost sensor. So like these are walkable distances. We should be thinking that these are very like intra-neighborhood conversations we're having right now. So when we start to think about this question from our partners of what was this impact, our sensors measure multiple things, but I've only pulled out for you here PM 2.5. So that's the primary regulated parameter for particulate matter pollution under the Clean Air Act. And it's a relatively useful one because it actually has a regulated 24-hour average. Some of them have more like annual averages that aren't very helpful in thinking about a short event like this. So I will plot for you also where this 24-hour average limit is on the following graphs. So we have some sense of like what the Clean Air Act kind of means in practice. And I want you to be keeping in mind that photograph I showed you of what actually happened here, okay? And this PM 2.5 parameter is also measured at this Mass DEP monitoring station, so we can do a side-by-side. The fire, like I told you, we could find some information about when the fire department got there, but we really don't know when it started. So we're kind of starting very early in the day on March 16th, pulling information, and then going to look until the 17th to see what kind of bounding we can get in time for when this event was actually happening. And I want us to start in this conversation about the data from the Mass DEP station, because for most communities everywhere, that is all they have. And actually most communities everywhere do not even have one of these in close proximity. So this is kind of already a very lucky scenario to have those data at one location very nearby. But I want us to be able to look at that and think about, is that sufficient, even though this is already kind of a privileged location relative to the national regulations and national network. And the one other thing I wanted to note was that the wind was coming from the south. So let's go back to this map for a second. The wind was coming from the south mostly on this day, and the fire was north of all of our sensors. So I want us all to just keep in mind, like, the effects we're seeing are probably not the maximum effects here, right? Because most of the smoke was probably blowing away from our sensor network. Okay, so jump in. First, I'm showing you just the regulatory data. And what you see here is that there's kind of a gentle rise in the monitoring data that shows like pollution was a little bit elevated starting midday. Remember, the fire department was there by 10:30. And we see sort of like, maybe the concentrations of this particular pollutant maybe double by the end of the day, but it's not like some crazy signal here that would make us think some horrible fire is happening. We never get anywhere near this average daily limit, right? So like based on this monitoring station, this was in complete compliance with the Clean Air Act. So that is our starting point. Okay, so if we look at our northernmost sensor, the one that was closest to this fire, this is what we see. Okay, some interesting features. First, we see that there is this like huge excursion. It's not all day, so it's not in violation of this limit, But it is pretty high temporary, well, 2 hours long concentrations. That was way before when we think the fire actually started. So this probably has nothing to do with this fire, but this is very local pollution that probably really matters to the people who live there. That's entirely missed by the regulatory station that's a quarter of a mile away. Um, and is an interesting feature. So this is the kind of thing we're starting to be able to see with our sensor network. And from this sensor, you can also see the pollution later in the day is much higher than what is being measured at the regulatory station. So in this evening feature, we're seeing that there is like 3 times to 4 times as much pollution as was there earlier in the day. And we're starting to kind of like close to this daily limit. But still, it's a daily average limit. This would not be in violation of the Clean Air. Okay, so if we put the rest of our sensors here, what I want you to take away is there is this pattern that all of our sensors are sort of like moving together. They're not all at exactly the same concentration, but we're sort of seeing this like systematic midday bump and then a much higher bump in the evening. This up and down is almost certainly changes in wind direction. And interestingly, our sensor that read the worst pollution, this one in blue, is the one halfway down Blue Hill Ave. So I think what we're seeing here is some really interesting effect of wind and air, like air dynamics, where smoke is going up, but then it's going sideways and then it's falling down because it's superheated, it rises, and then as it cools off, it's like sinking down in other parts of the neighborhood. So it's not just blowing directly from north to south. This would be really hard to anticipate. This would be really hard to model. We would never know exactly what's happening here unless we were measuring it. And we're only measuring it in one direction. So I have no idea how bad it was in the other directions, how far it spread, right? Okay, so those are some takeaways there. And then if we look into March 17th, you see it really tapered off as we got to the wee hours of the morning. So with our sensors, we can very clearly delineate when did this start, when did this end, sort of what was the physical extent. We know it went at least all the way to the other end of Blue Hill Ave. We can start to get a picture on what was going on there. All right, so taking away from this, I mean, my big lessons are this hyperlocal thing is so very real, right? Our sensors are really close together, but we're seeing quite significant differences between them across this neighborhood. And we're seeing quite significant differences between what they are reading and this regulatory station that's really not very far away. The things that I want to put on here is even in spite of all of this data, and in spite of how bad we know this event was, there is nothing we have here that shows that this violated the Clean Air Act because we were on the upwind side of the event. We really couldn't even capture the most significant impacts of it. And I mean, Dan explained to you how much work it was to put these many sensors up. I cannot even envision a future, although I would love it, how we would get sensors everywhere so we would never have this problem where we miss things. But it's a really interesting challenge for us all to think about. If we think these things are important, like how do we start to get data like this for all communities? And then the last thing that I want to say is we're just like skimming the surface here. This was a fire that was burning potentially extremely hazardous things. And this one number is not really telling us health risk. We don't know what was in those particles. We don't know how dangerous they were. They were certainly more dangerous than pollen, which is another particle. But exactly how dangerous is impossible for us to say with sensor measurements. And so with that, I think that we'd really love to have a conversation and answer any questions that anybody has. And Dan and Davis, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add before we open it up.
No, that was great. I think that yeah, I've got a ton of questions I'd love to ask, but I'd love to prioritize the people on the call first. And I saw that Tori had sent asked a question a little while ago about the connection with Public Works. I guess the Boston Public Works. How are they using the data? And if so, how are they?
think you'd
Um,
mentioned that,
Corey,
or
did it?
Dan had mentioned that they were, you have to make good friends because you need to work with the city in
yeah.
implementing these sensors. But I'm also curious if Public Works or other organizations, departments in the city are really interested in the outputs as well.
Yeah, I will mention one example I know of, and maybe Dan has a few others. The Parks Department, which is kind of underneath this division of the city, they are really interested in understanding what we see at the various parks where they are hosting sensors, especially to understand which of these might be particularly warmer or cooler. As Dan had mentioned, this is sort of a priority area where lots of people gather, lots of children are there, and the conditions there might be, for that reason, somehow more important to us to think about. So definitely in that context. Dan, I don't know if you have any other specific examples in mind you'd want to suggest here.
Yeah, nothing specific. I think though, Tori, it's a really interesting question, and maybe to the policy wonks, an interesting answer. That right, the city has made, as you alluded to, of many, many different agencies and departments, and so getting socializing a group of them to the idea that these data could be useful is it takes multiple different conversations. Right? So there is an Office of Green Infrastructure that is interested in the work, and they had requested a few places where they wanted us to put sensors in case, because they were planning some sort of intervention. Uh, there's the actual Office of Environment, who we talk to probably more than Public Works, to be honest, because they are the ones who are really thinking about what do these data mean? What does it mean to be putting these sorts of technologies out in the public? And we have a handful of collaborators there who are really thinking about the implications there. And then even the Office of Emerging Technology is inside the Department of Innovation Technology. So they've been thinking with us about ways to kind of put this in the hands of the data analytics team, and to make it a resource that the city itself thinks about. So yeah, it comes up a lot. Actually, one other that I'll trumpet. So I had mentioned What the Tech. What the Tech has a contract right now where we're working with the City of Boston and Boston Public Schools to build an environmental data science course for high school students, and we're going to be using the Common Senses data in that course,
Cool.
which is really exciting, right? To be able to go.
Where did you say? Which school?
So it's with Boston Public Schools in general. We're creating
Uh-huh.
it with
Okay,
the curriculum group at Central Administration, and
cool.
they're working right now to recruit teachers from multiple schools who will then connect with in May and provide the materials, and then we'll see who
Very
pilots it.
cool. Thank you.
I see we have a
Uh,
question from Zoe. Does Bari ever work? Or I guess maybe more accurately, what was your contribution to the Northeastern Climate Justice Action Plan? Maybe
yeah.
with some of those
And
conversations?
and I don't know if actually I can help uh, answer this as well. So the Climate Justice Action Plan, Northeastern Sustainability, our group here, organized that, and it was really an effort working with a lot of community members and some faculty and staff and students at Northeastern. And part of what those priorities that came out of the Climate Justice Action Plan were around air quality and community really, connecting that to issues around asthma and other things. So we've been really trying to get the word out and support some of the work Dan and Amy and Sarah, you all have been doing in this as really encouraging those connections, but would love to keep
Mhm.
doing more of that. Actually thinking about some of the work we are doing this summer for our hot summer cool break, and maybe let's touch base after this to yeah, circle back on that, how we might connect.
Mhm.
But I don't, Dan and Amy, if you have other thoughts on how you've connected or would like to connect to the goals in the plan, particularly around heat and air quality. Mm.
Yeah. I don't know. Amy, this is a fun one because Amy and I have not discussed this that I can remember. So you're going to get an uncoordinated answer from us. I mean, I think it's a very important initiative, right, that the university is taking, and I think really important for us to be good neighbors, right, and to counteract, the impacts of environment, and quite frankly, the impacts of having lots of really big buildings in the middle of an urban context that's alongside residential areas. I think that's just part and parcel of being a good neighbor. So it's really important that we're doing this. And Tori, really appreciate your leadership and the people you're working with on making this happen. I think from our perspective, the sensors and the data themselves are probably useful to the Climate Justice Action Plan because it captures some spaces that are relatively close to campus. And the workshops, the awareness, the advocacy, right? Just that sort of that capital of ability to engage these problems that the community has been building, I think are further values, and they're already there, right? The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative has been advocating for environmental justice since somewhere around 1985. But the extent that we, through this project, are able to connect with the things that the plan is envisioning and acting upon, I think that's exactly what we want to be doing.
Yeah, I really see this project as implementation and not just sort of in what you're creating of the sensor network, but exactly the way that you all are doing it and engaging community around what is important to you? Where do you want to see, where is important for you to understand what, I think I remember just hearing like people were, noticing the environmental impact of sound and that was something maybe the research team wouldn't have come up on their own. But because it's collaborative effort, it really gets at what is important, and then, as you mentioned, can be used by the community to really advocate and understand their environment.
Yeah, one other thing I would add in there is I think that, gosh, it's like such an interesting distinction between the idea of climate, which is like so big and so slow that it can never be a priority, and these other things that absolutely are a priority, like right now, with in terms of air quality and heat, which are not disconnected but are not the same thing. And I think that the conversation often is circling around decarbonization right now, which I mean, if I'm going to be honest, that's kind of like I care a lot about this, but I notice that it's something that people cannot engage with on a like near-term priority way because it doesn't connect with what am I doing today? What am I feeling today, or even next week, or even next year? Um, but the fact that many of the actions we can take for decarbonization are also having important impacts in terms of reducing urban heat island and reducing urban air pollution. Um, like any way we could make that bridge and be part of making that bridge and recording those changes, I think is a real value add to get people to buy into these longer term planning for the shorter term benefits too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Look, we have time. Maybe one more question. I have one if I don't see any others. Um, my question is, this feels well. First of all, I love the idea of the way that you just explained this story, Amy, because data really does tell a story, and that's how we connect this, right? If it's a bunch of plots on the paper, sometimes people have a difficult time interpreting it, but when you turn it into a story and say, look how, the air pollution rose and how it came back down, we can all visualize that. It feels to me that you are creating a foundation that could start to be built and interconnected with lots of other data, property values data and crime data and number of children within each of those communities, and then starting to see those kinds of connections. Noise data, I don't know if your sensors include noise, but clearly
They
that
do.
leads. Yeah,
They
At the
okay.
do.
request of the community, they do. Yeah.
Yes, that's great. So what other kind of data would you like as you're going on and you're going forward? I know that your plan, you said, is to increase the number of sensors, but um, what are some next steps that you want to say if we could really get some good X data, then that would really allow us to take a look at this in a completely different light.
Davis, I'll just put one caveat on that. I am now the supervisor of about between this project and another project, 200 and something sensors out in the world. I can't have any more. Somebody else needs to start adopting sensors. So
I'll take
I
one.
want cities to start doing this. I think, part of the mission is to figure out how we get cities on board that like this is
Mhm.
just critical infrastructure. But that was not your question. For me, and then I'll hand it over to Dan. I think that my biggest roadblock when we start to think about the data is that so much of what you just mentioned, the things we want to correlate to in terms of human health and exposure and who's being impacted, those data are all aggregated at census tract levels,
Yeah,
which is way too big of an aggregation for
right,
the scale of data that we are collecting right now. And I would love some brains to be thinking about how we get around that, because I think otherwise we're not capturing something meaningful if we don't know all those other things at the same scale of the data that we're measuring environmentally.
right.
So yeah, Amy's exactly right. First, on both things she said, right? The first one is we can't own these sensors forever, right? This was thanks to a generous NSF grant. The NSF doesn't give out money for things like this anymore. A little too well. We'd have to change a lot of words. But also long term, right? It's never intended that way. So like city and community have to then own the infrastructure. But now to the other point about needing data at the right scale. So um, the Boston Area Research Initiative actually curates a bunch of different data sets annually that are generated by administrative systems in the city. So we take them, we pretty them up, we make them more accessible geographically, and so that they can talk to census data and data like these as well. It includes 311 reports of non-emergencies, so infrastructure issues, including rats, 911 calls,
Hmm.
building permits, tax assessments, so a variety of other things that describe the building to building landscape of the entire city, not to mention this neighborhood. And so there are definitely some ways. So my fall course, Big Data for Cities, uh, tries to align these data with each other a bit and see if we can test some hypotheses like building permits. Do building permits on a street lead to higher air pollution, right, over time, or more heat, those sorts of things? So we have the capacity to do that. And we definitely have some partners on the team. One of our partners, a woman named Nicole Flint, she talks a lot about a particular zone of the neighborhood that is well known for it has a public housing complex. It has a challenging history and a challenging present to some extent. It's one of the higher crime spaces in the neighborhood. But it's also, looking at our data, one of the hottest spaces in the neighborhood. And she's really interested in the relationship between those things and whether the heat is causing or directly impacting the violence in some way is one question, but also just the broader question of like people on that street experience all of these different challenges, whether it be crime and heat and air pollution, so on and so forth. And that's a really important thing to know, right? That's a really kind of what you might call multifaceted exposure that, for children all the way up to adults and the elderly who might live there, that shapes their life. And that's really worth recording and acting upon.
That's fantastic. Well, I love this project. I think it's so Northeastern, it's just purely Northeastern in so many ways. I Tomorrow night we have opening remarks for this policy school event from Richard Freeland, who was the former president of Northeastern. So I've been reading his book, trying to get up to speed before getting involved in that panel. But one thing that he mentioned is that there's really only three things in a university can do or should do or is supposed to do, their purpose. One is teaching. Obviously, we want to be teaching our students and preparing them for their careers. The second is the research and scholarship, which could go in lots of different directions. And then the third is that we have to be the experts for the community. And as Dan, you said, maybe that's the nerds, right? That's who we are. But making that connection, because the city needs to be better off with us than without us. And one of the ways that it's better with us is if we're contributing in this kind of way. And I love this project because it seems like in this project you're doing all three, right? And that's why it just feels to me like such a Northeastern University kind of endeavor. So from all of us on the sustainability side, and I think from the university itself, we really appreciate all of the great work that you're doing. I think the community is probably starting to really recognize how big data is something that can also be exciting as well. Let's hope. Um, but let's go ahead and wrap that up here. Thanks so much for starting off our Sustainability Innovation Week with this wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot and really appreciate all the great work you're doing. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. This was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.